Well, it's either 7 or 8 in our series, The Simple Life, probably 8. But basically, the essence of the teaching that we've been engaged in for 7 weeks prior has been that if we don't learn to simplify our lives, then we will limit our experience of the supernatural, represented by the light and power of God's presence and the understanding that that presence brings to us. We'll wind up living a natural Christianity, won't look a lot different than people without the Lord in terms of your experience of the supernatural, because complicity, when your life becomes complicated, it closes out the kind of focus that is required to experience God in a supernatural way. So we have to learn to simplify our lives. And, for the first 6 Sundays or so, we spent time looking at the supernatural ways you do that. The shortcuts you can take. I talked a couple Sundays ago about the shortcut, for instance, of prayer. We spent a lot of time in Ephesians 1:17. But God wants you to live in the light, walk in the light, not just pass through the light occasionally. Amen. And so there are natural things we need to do to simplify things, simplification involving better management of our life's resource as God's steward. And basically the 3 categories we've been putting everything in regarding our management responsibility, and managing better will remove a lot of the complications, will simplify. In the natural, you put that with the things that we can do spiritually, and I believe we'll walk in the light. But management of our time, management of our physical resource, which we've been given while we live in this natural world, and money being the medium of exchange that represents that realm, makes it easier to say money management, time management, money management, and then management of our relationships, the most significant management responsibility of all. And so last week we spent on the first sermon on time management. We're going to continue today, but let's take a look at the verse that set us on this course in Ephesians chapter 5. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 14. Wherefore he saith, Awake, thou that sleepest, and arise from the dead, and Christ shall give thee light. And, that might seem a remarkable statement, when you realize he's talking to the church at Ephesus, and you'll say, these people aren't dead, are they? Well, he's talking about the old man that died with Christ. Earlier in this passage, he's telling us to put off the old man, put on the new. If you don't put off the old man, then you're sleeping. And it's the same as rising from the dead in order to experience the light of God's presence and understanding. See then that you walk circumspectly, not as fools, but as wise, redeeming the time. This is the way you stay in the light, redeeming the time because the days are evil. Redeem means to recover that which is lost. And he is implying with clarity that when you're in the natural, when you're living according to the carnal dictates of your old man, you're going to lose a lot of time. You're going to waste a lot of time. And if you don't do something to change it, your days will turn out evil. He says, if you don't redeem the time, if you keep living according to the carnal dictates, your days will turn out evil. And if we looked at this verse in the Amplified, making the very most of the time, that's what time management is. Making the very most of the time, buying up each opportunity. So we have a scriptural mandate to manage our time. If we don't, the days will turn out evil. They're already evil. The only way you can avoid that evil is through conscious and deliberate management of your time. And so this is the basis for doing what we've been doing. This is the second Sunday now. Last Sunday, we talked a lot about the practical definition of time management being building a schedule. And I would suggest that that be done, in writing, not just building your schedule mentally for today, what you got to do. No, you need to lay it out. And it needs to begin with an annual calendar where you can put in your big events, important things you want to get accomplished, get all of that in there, which as you review it monthly and weekly will give you the framework for building a daily calendar. We used the example last time together of the typical 40-hour work week, 8-hour day, starting at 8 in the morning, working until 5 in the afternoon, hour for lunch, and just use that simply because that's probably what most people are involved in. It could be your schedule is different than that, but the principles remain the same. And we made the point that you've got two aspects to your time management challenge. That's your vocational schedule, what you need to do during that 8 hours of allocation for your work, and it's important that you plan that time. If you want to advance or succeed in your vocational pursuit, it's just as important that you manage that 8-hour time frame. We talked about some things to do and not to do in that regard. Building your schedule vocationally so that you got, a 15-minute pad for every appointment because they're never going to work out to be as long as you think. To leave 20% of your work day, that 8 hours, unscheduled. And that would be the shock absorber that takes care of a lot of unplanned things that raise their head. But then in addition to the vocational segment of your time management effort, you've got your personal life, which is just significant, if not more so. We talked a lot about that as well. And then at the end of your work day and the personal time that you scheduled, if you got up at 5 in the morning, which you can do if you go to bed at 10 o'clock at night, you can get 7 hours of sleep. This is just my opinion, what a smart person would do. But if you happen to be somebody that stays up late, the principle's still the same. If you sleep 7 hours, you've got 17 left that you can schedule. So using my preference of getting up earlier, starting your day at 5, we went through the whole example, and once you get home at 6 o'clock, allowing plenty of time for commuting, wherever you have to go, and you're up until 10, you've got 4 hours of downtime. We'll call it white space because it's unscheduled, and it should be so. And that represents 20% of the entire 17-hour day. And so essentially, that provides a pattern of understanding that I think is healthy and will help you get off on the right track. I stopped preaching last Sunday by saying there's another principle involved in time management that will determine whether you're successful in that endeavor or not, in terms of your ability to meaningfully schedule yourself and your day, and then being able to implement it. You can put something on paper, but it's no good to you if you can't actually implement it when the time comes. And this one principle that is going to determine your success or failure is what I saved for this weekend. But I told the Lord that with the snow and so many people not here, I probably need to save it for another week. And I really do think that way. I said, Lord, you really want me to deliver this word today? We just had a snowstorm. Wouldn't you rather me wait until next weekend? We've got more people. He said, no, you do it when I tell you to do it. And it's the same thing with the message. So the principle that will enable success in planning your time is the principle of prioritization. Prioritizing your time. And it's not something, seems almost like, oh, that's simple. That's no great revelation. But it is for most people in practice. Because it's like most people have a hard time deciding which things are most needed, in their scheduling. And I'll tell you, wind up with more priorities than they ought to have. Everything works out being a priority, and then your schedule is just flat unmanageable. It'll drive you up a wall, and it'll cause you to throw the whole process of time management in the trash can. So you need to know how to prioritize. And of course, the basic truth is the whole Bible is an example of prioritization. God prioritizes for us, the decisions that we're to make, the choices that we're to make. Choose good, not evil. Blessing, not cursing. Life, not death. And the whole Bible is a revelation of how to begin the prioritizing process. But that's not the challenge, because most people, particularly believers, don't have a problem distinguishing between right and wrong, good or bad. So it's not hard to prioritize between those things. But the kicker really comes when you have to prioritize between two good things. When both things, or the things you want to do, are all good things, how do you choose then which is the best? How do you begin prioritizing at that point? The truth is, it's a cliche, but it's still a truth, that good is the greatest enemy of best. And in the process of choosing how you're going to prioritize all of your resource, your time, your money, your effort, but we're talking about time for this particular session, it's still a matter of picking which is the best as opposed to the good, because you're going to have to scratch a lot of good things. I forget who it was that used the example of a lighthouse operator, back before the coming of electricity, and he'd have to light his beacon with fuel oil, and of one sort or another, but oil. To light a lamp, a big lamp that was then, mirrors magnified and directed the beam and concentrated the beam. And you could see that beam for miles and miles out at sea. And the mariners would be warned away from, shallow water, shoals or rocks, that kind of thing. And there was this one lighthouse keeper, so it said, that lived just outside a little village. I think it was in Ireland. And he got a monthly delivery of fuel oil that was to last him, and lighten his beacon for that month, then he'd get another delivery. There was one month in particular that he had several requests of him. This little old woman knocked on his door, the door of the lighthouse, and he answered, and she said, "My family and I are freezing. We need oil so we can stay warm." Well, he gave her some oil. It was a good thing to do. Not too much later, a few days later, a man knocks on his door. It was after dark. He was desperate. His little 8 or 9-year-old boy had gotten lost, apparently, coming home from the fields, and he needed oil for his lamp to go search for him. Another good thing. Well, you know exactly where this is going. After 2 or 3 more such requests, and there were good things, and so he gave him the oil. But then he ran out of oil before the end of the month, and he got his next shipment. There was a big storm a day or 2 later. He had no oil for the beacon. A ship piled up on the rocks, and many lives were lost. And he was really sad about this, repentant about it. But the truth is, the oil was for the beacon. There were other good things it could be used for, but its priority purpose was for the beacon. And so we can see that good is often the enemy of best, and our deciding how we're going to invest the resource of our life, you're going to have to say no to some good things. And the first rule of thumb, I don't know if you want to call it a rule of thumb, but just concept that we need to embrace is that we always must give precedence to the most important as opposed to the most urgent. But most people fall in the trap of going with the urgent. Urgency cannot be the basis for what you prioritize for your effort or your time or your money. It has to be the most important. Which reminds me of another story, one that's close to my heart because, of my aviation background. But there was a Delta Airlines crash I don't know how many years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago now, in the Everglades. A Lockheed L-1011, big tri-jet, was one of the first wide bodies, called the Cadillac of the wide bodies, a beautiful airplane. And one of these L-1011s on a flight to Miami, they were on approach to Miami, they put the landing gear down, and they only got two indicator lights, indicating both main gear were down, but the nose wheel indicator light remained dark. And so they called approach and said, we have an indication of a possible unsafe gear. It's either not down or it's not locked, one of the two. So approach gave them vectors back out to over the Okefenokee swamp, and so they could work on the problem outside the stream of traffic going into Miami. Told them to give them a call when they were ready to make their approach. Because there are procedures to put down a landing gear that doesn't go down hydraulically. And so, in the tapes after the accident, they could hear the three pilots in the cockpit, the captain, the first officer, the second officer. Man, they were all going after this challenge, trying to figure out what it was. Turned out later to be a burned out bulb in the indicator light. That's all it was. The gear was down and it was locked. But they didn't know that at that point. And so they're going through all of their checklists and procedures, and he's sending the flight engineer down into the belly of the airplane to visually check and see if the lock indicators were lined up and blah, blah. Well, in the meantime, while they're busy with this urgent emergency, somebody forgot to fly the airplane. And of course, the captain had put the autopilot on, thinking that would give him the ability to give more attention to the problem. But aircraft control is the most important consideration of all. And somewhere in the scuffle, they think somebody bumped a trim switch on one of the control yokes with the elbow or something, which knocks the autopilot off. And it very slowly started a descending turn. Took about 5 minutes, but then there were a ball of flame in the Okefenokee. A couple hundred people got killed because they put the urgent ahead of the important. Every class I've ever been in, and I go to one every year at flight safety, is to reinforce emergency procedure response. And the first item is always the same: fly the airplane, control the aircraft. Doesn't matter if your engine falls off or you get hit by a comet. It doesn't make any difference if you don't fly the airplane. And so it's the most important consideration, even though there was great urgency to get the landing gear problem solved because, they got limited fuel. They got to get it down and get the landing made. But there's always a priority that you have to consider. What is more important? It's not urgent that decides the issue, it's most important. And so when you're considering how to allocate your time or any other resource, you allocate it first by prioritizing to the most important, and then the second most important, and then the third most important. Now, if urgency is a factor, and it happens to line up with the most important, then that obviously is what you put on the top of your list. But if it's important but not urgent, then it has the possibility of being rescheduled to another week or a later time when your schedule is more able to accommodate it. But thirdly, if it's not important, even if it's urgent, then it's something you should delegate if you can. And if you can't, and you have to make time choices, then it gets scratched. Most things can be delegated. In a business environment, it's probably easier to see, but you have to delegate in your personal life too. Your personal schedule or plans will get all fouled up if you don't set things, in order of importance, and your planning in order of importance, and then delegate when things get too crowded. That's what wives are for. Just seeing if y'all are awake or not. Obviously, a husband and a wife should consider each other resources, in their times of, not having enough time to get everything done. Sometimes it may be appropriate that the husband take the kids to school or that the wife take the children to school, depends on those demands. But you can always delegate as a way to avoid, something urgent just being completely canceled if it didn't carry that level of importance. But then beyond the husband-wife relationship, you ought to start delegating to your kids the moment they're old enough to put on their own pants. You should begin delegating to them and not doing things for them. Don't be cleaning up their room. You make them clean up their room. And when they're old enough, they can do their laundry. And they can have their own little kitchen duty responsibility as well. And as far as, yard work is concerned, my own approach was as soon as my boys were as tall as the handle on the lawnmower, they got to mow the lawn. Amen. Basically, delegation is one of the things that makes your life manageable. You don't have to do everything yourself. You do have to itemize on the basis of what's most important, or prioritize rather, on the basis of what's most important, not most urgent. And this will be the first step in beginning to successfully prioritize your time. The second step that I think is really important, these are not necessarily in order of importance, the steps aren't, but they are principles that will help you be more effective in your prioritizing. The second thing I want you to think about is something called the Pareto Principle. Back when I got off of active duty in the military, and I had bought a small FBO, fixed base operation, and from that started an air freight business. I decided I'd better learn some more about business principles, so I took some classes that were offered by Andrew Carnegie School of Business. He was a famous American industrialist that really is still widely read and respected today, but he referred to something called the Pareto Principle. Now, this was 50 years ago, or almost 45 years ago, that I'm learning about the Pareto Principle, and some decades before that, this Italian economist named Pareto, forget his first name, had come up with this. Through years of observation and experimentation, he established what was most widely known as the 80-20 principle. That is the Pareto Principle, the 80-20 principle. And it just works out. It doesn't matter where you apply it in life. It just works out that way. But the principle says basically that 20% of your priorities are going to produce 80% of your productivity. 20% of your priorities are going to give you 80% of your productivity or success. So, the challenge comes in identifying that 20% of your priorities, because that's where you need to focus the large majority of your effort in order to get the 80% productivity. 20% of your priorities give you 80% of your productivity if the majority of your resource of time, money, and effort are invested in that 20%. But it applies in so many different places. I mean, when I first got into the ministry, somebody said to me, and I thought at that time, well, that's the Pareto Principle. But somebody said to me that 20% of your congregation is going to give 80% of the finances. And do you know that is true almost to the exact percentage? It doesn't matter how much I get up there and beat my gums and holler and shout, and I don't really do that. But it wouldn't make any difference because it seems like that principle, and it hurts because that means only 20% of the congregation is going to reap the kind of harvest that all 100% would like to reap. But anyway, so 20% of the congregation going to produce 80% of the income. 20% of the people we counsel occupy 80% of the pastoral staff's time. These are true. These are established. It's also true that 80% of the people, or 20% of the people at a picnic, eat 80% of the food. I mean, the 80-20 principle is just a fact. It just works out that way. So then, as it would apply to our efforts to prioritize the investment of our life's resource, then it would be important to know that 20% of your team, if you're a business operator, an entrepreneur, then that means your staff, I guess. Or if you work for a company, your department, or whoever you are interacting with as a team in your vocational pursuit, 20% of the people on that team are going to produce 80% of the value that that team comes up with. So this says to you, all right, well then, I want to, if I'm going to be managing my time, I'm going to invest my people time. Because there's some things you do that don't involve other people, but I'm going to invest 80% of my people time in the top 20% of my team that generates most of the productivity. This is a fact. I can look at this in my business days. I can look at it here in the ministry days. This is just the way it works out. And if I want to have my time to be as productive as it can be, then my people investment is going to be in the top 20% of my team. Now, who is my team? It's not the entire staff because I don't interact with most of them on any kind of regular basis. I would say that the leadership portion of our staff, we have 300 staff members, and there's probably, associate level of ministry, pastoral staff, and department heads, probably 50 people. And I do, consider that, I guess, even though I don't talk to a lot of them frequently. You'll hear the reason why momentarily, but basically, if that's my team, then 20% of them, which would be 10 people, are going to produce 80% of the success of this ministry. So I'm going to spend most of my personal interaction time with those 10 people. And I actually look back at my phone calling and my interaction with people. It's not a scientifically accurate estimate, but it's close. And it's 8 to 10 people that I talk with either on the phone or in person, I'd say 80% of the time. And they're the ones that I would least want to do without. I mean, there are some people on the staff you would just dread ever losing because they are so productive. And, they're the ones that always produce, that always are able to generate the good ideas and not just have the ideas. A lot of people have a lot of ideas. But, it's interesting, only 2 out of 10 ideas are going to be good. That's a fact. A lot of people generate a lot of ideas, and you need that. But, then there's only 20% of those that generate the ideas that are able to make them produce the desired result. And those people are absolutely invaluable. And that is where, my time's going to be invested, and the same can be true for you. I mean, all of this, the 80-20 principle has as much application to our personal life and simplifying our personal life as it does in time management. For instance, 20% of your possessions produce 80% of value added to your life. Only 20% of your possessions. Now, I kind of learned this the hard way. As you start having extra money, as God prospers you, you get more things. Everything from snowmobiles to ATVs to boats to motorcycles, Harley Davidsons to fancy cars to airplanes. The more things you've got, the more you will realize that there are only a couple of those things. Now, I didn't even go into the really big items like shoes, purses, all of that. My wife destroys the Pareto Principle because instead of wearing 20% of the shoes she buys, she only wears about 2%. And the other 100 pairs sit in there. Never mind, she's not here at the moment. But typically, all of this is true. Okay, well then, 20% of the clothes in your closet you wear 80% of the time. Look at it. So what are you carrying around all of this baggage for? What did you waste all of that money for? What are you having all of those vehicles sitting in your garage for that you pay insurance on and never dust off? I mean, some people say, I wish I had that problem. But basically, it complicates your life. It's not a problem you want. You need to be wise enough to understand this principle applies to everything. 20% of your leisure time produces 80% of your enjoyment in life. So this all suggests some significant modification. But here's the real biggie. 20% of those closest to you produce 80% of your happiness. So who do you want to spend time with? You want to listen to the gripers, the complainers? Do you want to spend a little more time with those people that make you feel about that big and, make you wish you hadn't gotten out of bed that morning? No. The best investment of your time is going to be to close the door on as much of that as you can and invest your time in the 20% of the people that support you, that stabilize you emotionally, that build you up and make you happy. So the Pareto Principle, amen. The Pareto Principle applies to every aspect of our life and will help you prioritize in a way that is meaningful where you should invest the resource of your life. So, I would let this part of our discussion be something you think a lot more about at a later time because it's amazing how accurate it is. I mean, you say, where's this in Scripture? Well, Jesus had 12 disciples. How many really made a mark? Peter, James, and John. 20%. He had 70 people traveling with him. How many disciples did he have? 12. 20%, plus or minus a few. It works in every area of life. And so you need to understand this principle of prioritizing successfully. So, yes, you have to be able to distinguish between important and urgent, but then the investment or allocation of life resource into certain goals or objectives or priorities need to be measured. I think one way to measure those is with the 80-20 principle. Now, there's another three things that, who was it? Who's the leadership guy? John Maxwell. I've heard him teach this, that when your calling or your job, the requirements of your job, coincide with the things you do better than you do anything else, and those two things coincide with what you enjoy the most, then you will succeed to a degree that would not otherwise be possible. Your alignment of your vocational pursuit should be made with that in mind. If I'm going to hire on to do something, then do the requirements of that job, do they represent an area that I'm really good at doing? Well, that's the first consideration, because if you can't do it with a hoot, you're not going to succeed in it. You might be able to learn a little bit about it over the long haul, but do the things that you're required to do on your job align with what you are really good at doing, and number three, what you would do for free if you had to, because you like it so much. And when these things align, you're set for success. When I'm considering my own priorities, okay, what am I required to do? And I'm just using this as an example, I don't know about your life, I know about mine. What am I called to do? I'm called to the full-time ministry, and that means the first requirement of my job is to preach the word. I mean, that's what the fivefold ministry offices are supposed to do, perfect the saints so they can do the work of the ministry. That means preaching the word. Doesn't matter what office of ministry a person's called to, that's the first and foremost responsibility, preach the word. And in order to preach a good word, according to the example we have in the book of Acts, which talks about the generation of the ministry of helps, so the apostles could give themselves to study and prayer. Why? So they can preach the word. There's no contest. That's my first job. And so no matter how many hours a week it may take, and it still takes me probably half a day on Friday, all day Saturday, and then the preaching of the services on the weekend. And, that happens before anything else does, because that's my priority. Now, I'm trying to identify the 20% where I need to invest my life. That also happens to be the preaching that, I have labored at developing a natural ability to deliver the word and have succeeded to a degree. And so, I'm okay at it. And then, I love doing it. It's the only thing I like doing more than flying. It's when you preach under the anointing of God, and then the feedback comes over the years, about people's lives that have been touched or changed. There is nothing more gratifying than that. And so, that's my top. But then my second, because that's only about 10%, of the top priorities I have in my job, but requirements of my job. And the next would be, something that I've always enjoyed doing, and I think I'm fairly gifted in doing it. I've had good fruit, and that's cash flow, the management of cash flow strategy. Not the management of a budget or the cash flow itself. I've got people in our accounting office that are very good at doing that. But in terms of planning how both to generate the income and then apply the income, is something that I think is the responsibility of the highest office of ministry. I mean, and it's something that I am reasonably good at doing, and I enjoy the satisfaction of putting together a plan and seeing it work, a financial plan. So these are my top two. This is where 80% of my time is going to go. You know, all of the phone calls, all of the requests for appointments, all of the other things that occur, you know, take place only behind, you know, this 20% is going to get 80% of my time. That's the biggest contribution I can make to the ministry's success, is by being sure I invest proper resource in my top 20%. And this is what you've got to figure. Where is your time best served? You know? Where are you going to invest? Now, there's got to be some people time in there if you're going to be in leadership role at all, and I do. But 80% of it's going this other place. And then people time, it's going to be the top 10 people that I invest 80% of my people time with. So I'm just saying these things as examples of how you can decide to invest, you know, your best effort in what areas of your life. This is how I think you make the determination of what's really most important. If making money right out of the box is the most important thing to you, you will misprioritize every time. Because if you don't have the skill level or the enjoyment in what you do, doesn't matter what your job description is, you're not going to make it work. And it is making it work that will ultimately produce a financial return. And that's why I've said to young people making a decision about vocational choices that are going to be before them. You don't go where the money is. You go where your heart is. You go where you just love it. It doesn't matter if it's studying ants or insects or astrophysicist, or it doesn't matter if you're a nanny or a cab driver or a housewife and mom. It doesn't matter. If you go where your heart is, you will be successful, and success always has a component of financial increase. Amen. And that's where you'll be happy. You never make the decision on the basis of money. But, you know, you identify where your heart is, what would make you most excited. As I've said before, that will be reinforced by your natural skill levels and gifting and ability. And that's the direction you want to orient your life. But this is supposed to be about time management. So I'll come back again to prioritization in general as it relates to the investment of your time, which is the first and arguably one of the most important commodities you'll ever have to manage. But the third thing about time management is at the very top of your list, you need to plan your white space, or it'll get eaten up if you don't. Your unscheduled time. That's where your thinking will occur. That's where your self-realization will occur. All of these things important to your success. That's where your vision is born. That's where God imparts ideas to you. Yes, it can be part of your time with the Lord, but it needs to be also time that you can refresh and rebound and restore from the tension of a busy workday. So it might be doing something you enjoy in that unscheduled time, that white time. It might be fishing. You know, for me, there's nothing quite as positive in my soulish restoration as flying is, you know, aerobatic, recreational flying. You got your deal. I don't know what your deal is, but there's something you enjoy that refreshes you. And you need to deliberately give time for these kinds of things, that white space that we talked about. 4 hours, unscheduled time a day. The weekends, if you don't work a couple of days a week, whatever days you don't work. Vacation time, it's all important, and you've got to plan it. Because it won't happen if you don't, and that has to go as perhaps one of the most important priorities. I mean, there'll be times when something else is more eminently important than your time off, and you might sacrifice a little bit. But day in and day out, you got to keep your unscheduled time as a priority. Because if you don't, then, you're gonna run out of ideas. You're going to be a shallow person when it comes to self-realization, knowing what gifts you've got, what emotional capacities you have, because they have to be managed if you're going to succeed. The thinking time to see where you're going and what you want to do with your life. You got to have that kind of time. So if you got 4 hours at the end of your day, and plus you need to invest in your family. So if you got 4 hours at the end of your day, how can you find time for your device or the television? Television, you're a voyeur in somebody else's fantasy world. Unless you watch the military channel or I'm just teasing. No, seriously. The less time you spend in front of the TV or the less time you use with your device, social media, the more creative capacity you're going to develop. Because thinking time, introspection, time with the Lord, and then family time and recreational time are all what make you a healthy human being.